The rain had not yet begun when Inspector Moreau first heard the sound, a thin, wavering cry threading through the early morning quiet of the Quai des Orfèvres. It came from somewhere far beyond the window panes, drifting up the Seine like something torn loose from a nightmare. Paris was still wrapped in the bluish stillness that hangs before dawn, when even the river seems to hold its breath. Yet that cry, faint as a child calling from the edge of a dream, reached him with an urgency that stirred something old and unsettled inside him. He had heard voices like that before, in forgotten alleys and provincial train yards, when lives cracked open in the dark and no one came quickly enough. Moreau stood motionless beside the coat rack, one hand resting on his felt hat, the other tracing the grain of the wooden brim as if the familiar texture could anchor him. Somewhere in the city, a telegram operator was stoking a kerosene lamp, a street cleaner was dragging a cart across wet stones, and a woman in a shuttered room was listening to a man's steps fade down the stairwell. Paris at that hour was full of secret awakenings. But the voice he thought he heard did not belong to any of those. It carried the raw timbre of someone trapped, someone running out of breath or hope or both. He would later tell himself that the moment was nothing more than imagination, a fragment of memory mistaken for sound. And yet, when the knock arrived at his office door, sharp, hurried, and repeated, Moreau already knew the day would turn in the direction of that cry. He felt it in the marrow of his tired bones, in the faint tremor that passes through a man when fate begins to gather itself just out of sight. When Janvier stepped inside, raincoat half-buttoned and cheeks ruddy from running, the younger inspector's expression confirmed what Moreau had sensed long before the words were spoken. "There's been a discovery," Janvier said, breath tight, voice low. "A well on the outskirts of Villeneuve-sur-Lac. A boy found a bundle at the bottom. They think—" But he could not finish. The cry Moreau thought he'd heard seemed to echo again, softer now, swallowed by the cold morning air. He took his coat, extinguished the lamp, and followed Janvier out into the unsettled dawn. And so began the case that Paris would whisper about for weeks, the case that would stir rumors from the cafés near Pont-Neuf to the little bars overlooking the Canal Saint-Martin. The case that would test not only Moreau's instincts, but the limits of what a man can witness without carrying its shadow for the rest of his life. Before we descend into this mystery, if you find yourself drawn to Inspector Moreau's world, the rain-soaked boulevards, the quiet human tragedies, the moral fog that settles over every clue, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue creating these immersive investigations and ensures you never miss the next journey into Simenon's Paris. The fields surrounding Villeneuve-sur-Lac still held the last traces of dawn frost when Inspector Moreau stepped off the carriage and felt the first breath of the countryside move across his face. It carried the scent of damp leaves and turned earth, mingled with the faint sweetness of wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. The town itself seemed to be waking reluctantly, as though unsure it wished to see the day that waited for it. A dog barked once, sharply, then fell silent. Somewhere far off, a rooster called with the weary voice of a creature roused too early. And standing near the old stone well at the heart of the village square was a boy of no more than 12, pale and trembling, one hand gripping the rough edge of the circular wall as though it kept him from collapsing. Moreau approached slowly, conscious of how the villagers' eyes followed him. They hovered in doorways, behind shutters, beneath the crooked eaves of houses that had weathered decades of wind and rain. The crowd was not large, but its silence pressed tightly around the square like damp cloth. Even the familiar sound of hooves on cobblestones seemed muted, fading into the background as though afraid to intrude upon the gravity that had settled over the place. The boy looked up when Moreau neared, his lashes wet, his lips parted as if he had forgotten how to breathe since making his discovery. "You're the inspector from Paris," the boy whispered, voice barely rising above the rustle of the wind. Moreau nodded. The child swallowed hard and his knuckles whitened on the stone rim. He gestured downward, toward the darkness inside the well. Moreau stepped forward, feeling the chill drift upward from the depths. It was an old structure, its stones slick with moss where morning light never reached. The well had long been dry, but the cold trapped within it seemed to come from another world entirely. As Moreau leaned over the edge, he saw only the dim outline of the heavy wooden bucket far below. Its rope frayed, its surface darkened by years of neglect. And beside it, barely visible through shadow, was the shape the boy had seen at dawn. Something wrapped in cloth, unmoving, oppressive in its stillness. The villagers watched Moreau's expression with the sort of fearful reverence that small towns reserve for tragedies not yet fully named. He felt their anticipation, their dread, their desperate hope that someone else would carry the burden of understanding what lay at the bottom. No one spoke, but he sensed they all knew more than their silence allowed. It was a knowledge that clung to them like mud on boots, pulled from the very earth beneath their homes. "Who found it?" Moreau asked gently. "I did," the boy whispered. "I heard. I thought I heard something, like someone calling, but when I looked down..." His words trailed off into a tremor that shook his narrow shoulders. "I didn't mean to wake everyone, I didn't know what else to do." Moreau placed a hand on the boy's arm, steadying him. It was a gesture he rarely offered, but something about the child's sincerity, the rawness of his fear, compelled him. The boy nodded once, as though grateful for permission to breathe again, and stepped back to join his mother, who drew him close with hands that trembled as fiercely as his. By then, Janvier had arrived with 2 gendarmes from the local post. The rope was secured, knots checked, lantern lit. Moreau held the lantern high, watching the flame flicker against the swirling grain of the rising daylight. Its glow caught in the villagers' eyes, revealing exhaustion and sleeplessness, but also something deeper, something like guilt, though he could not yet tell whose or why. The gendarmes lowered a hook into the well, the rope creaking in protest as it uncoiled. The crowd leaned forward as the hook reached the bottom, scraped stone, then caught on the edge of the fabric. One gendarme steadied the rope, the other began to draw it upward with slow, deliberate strength. The bundle rose inch by inch, shedding droplets that darkened the stone beneath it. Even before it breached the lip of the well, Moreau sensed its weight. Not just its physical heaviness, but the unseen burden it carried for the people gathered around him. A murmur spread through the crowd, something between a prayer and a gasp, as the shape cleared the edge and was lowered onto the cobblestones. The cloth was tightly knotted, darkened by moisture and age. Moreau knelt beside it. His fingers traced the coarse fabric, feeling the stiffness beneath. He inhaled the mingled scents of earth, mildew, and something faintly metallic that lingered in the morning air. A woman cried out softly, muffling her mouth with her apron. A man beside her pulled off his cap and lowered his gaze. Even Janvier, usually steady, shifted uneasily, his breath fogging in the cold. Moreau loosened the knot with careful fingers. The cloth parted just enough to reveal what lay within. A small hand, pale, still, fragile as porcelain. The cry Moreau had imagined hearing in Paris seemed to echo inside him, hollow and unrelenting, as though carried from the bottom of the same well. His chest tightened, not with shock, for he had witnessed such scenes before, but with a sorrow that always returned in moments like this. He closed the cloth again, sealing the hand from view, and stood. Around him, whispers broke open like cracks spreading through ice. The villagers' faces turned toward one another, expressions shifting with the weight of recognition, memory, and fear. "Who lived near this well?" Moreau asked, scanning the gathered crowd. An elderly man, stooped and leaning heavily on a stick, cleared his throat. "The Lenoir farm," he rasped. "Madame Lenoir keeps the place now. Her husband died last winter." Moreau nodded, filing the name away. It did not surprise him. Names tended to surface early in such cases, called forth by the gravity of the moment. Some were meaningful, Others were merely convenient footholds for village gossip. But the way the old man spoke, reluctantly, as though the syllables of her name carried their own unease, suggested a deeper thread worth following. Before Moreau could respond, a gust of wind swept across the square, rattling shutters and carrying a faint metallic clink from somewhere near the churchyard. The villagers flinched, their nerves stretched taut. Moreau watched them closely. He had worked enough rural cases to recognize when a community braced itself against truths it did not wish to confront. They stood like people waiting for a storm they had long denied was coming. "Where is Madame Lenoir now?" Moreau asked. No one answered immediately. Faces turned away. A woman muttered something to her husband. A young man stared at the ground as though searching for his own shoes. Finally, the same elderly man sighed and lifted his chin. "She's at home," he said quietly. "But she won't want visitors." Moreau looked toward the narrow path leading out of the square, winding between houses with peeling shutters and small gardens enclosed by low stone walls. The path curved toward the outskirts, disappearing behind a stand of bare trees. Beyond them, he knew, lay the Lenoir farm. He turned back to the crowd, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "Everyone will be questioned," he said softly. "Not accused, but questioned for the sake of the child." The air thickened with that word, child, as though it were a stone dropped into deep water. Ripples of grief and guardedness spread through the villagers. Some nodded, others folded their arms or stepped closer to their loved ones. Moreau sensed a collective tightening of secrets, a pulling inward that often preceded deception or confession. "We'll need a cart to bring the bundle to the inn," Janvier said, voice hushed. Moreau nodded, watching as the gendarmes prepared to lift the small, shrouded form. The boy who had found it hid his face in his mother's skirt, clutching handfuls of fabric as though afraid to let go of the only solid thing in the world. As Moreau began walking toward the path leading to the Lenoir farm, he felt the weight of the well's depth lingering behind him. The cold, rising from it, still clung to his coat, settling between the seams like a silent omen. The villagers watched him depart, their breaths forming small clouds that dissolved into the crisp air. The square behind him fell into a hush that seemed too deliberate, too heavy to be mere mourning. It was the hush of people who feared what might surface from the bottom of more than just a well. And as Moreau stepped beyond the last row of houses, heading toward Madame Lenoir and the locked rooms of her past, he realized that the cry he had heard in Paris might not have been a trick of imagination after all. Something about this place, this morning, this well, felt woven with threads of fate he could not yet see. The countryside around him was quiet, but the silence carried its own stories. Stories waiting, trembling, just below the surface. The case had barely begun, and yet the air already felt heavy with truth. The path to the Lenoir farm followed the curve of the fields, cutting a pale line through the dark soil that had been turned and turned again over the years. The frost that clung to the stubble of harvested crops glittered faintly in the weak morning light, and each step Moreau took seemed to press a little deeper into the damp earth, as though the land itself were reluctant to let him go. Janvier walked half a pace behind, his notebook tucked into his coat pocket, his gaze moving from the distant farmhouse to the haze of smoke rising from its chimney. It was not yet midday, and yet the day felt already old, burdened by what had been drawn from the bottom of the well. From a distance, the Lenoir house looked like many others in the region, a low rectangular structure of stone and timber, its roof sagging slightly where time had pressed upon it. A line of washing hung limp in the cold air, abandoned halfway through its task. The yard was quiet, save for the soft clucking of hens near a wooden coop and the occasional creak of a loose shutter brushing against its frame. A cart wheel leaned against the side of the barn, its rim half buried in mud and moss. Nothing about the house announced tragedy, and yet, as they approached the door, Moreau felt a tension in the air, a kind of watchfulness, as though the house itself had drawn breath and was waiting to learn who came knocking. He lifted his hand and rapped gently on the wooden door. The sound was dull, absorbed by the thickness of the walls. For a moment, nothing moved. Then he heard light footsteps crossing the floor inside, the faint scuff of slippers on worn boards. The latch lifted with a soft click. The door opened just enough for a narrow line of warm, shadowed interior to appear, and in that gap stood Madame Lenoir. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, though grief and hard work had added a layer of tiredness to her features. Strands of dark hair had escaped the knot at the back of her head, framing a face that might once have been lively, perhaps even pretty, but now seemed perpetually on the verge of retreat. Her eyes, a deep brown, flickered over the two men, measuring them with a guarded, almost furtive intelligence. She wore a simple dark dress and a faded shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, as if she felt a cold that came from within rather than from the weather. "Yes?" Her voice was soft but steady. "Madame Lenoir?" Moreau asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I am Inspector Moreau, from Paris. This is Inspector Janvier. We've come about the discovery in the village square this morning." For a heartbeat, nothing in her face changed. Then a faint tremor passed through her lips, quickly suppressed. She opened the door wider, stepping back to let them in. The warmth of the interior enveloped them as they crossed the threshold, carrying with it the mingled scents of coffee, ash, and something faintly floral. Lavender, perhaps, lingering from sachets tucked into drawers long ago. The main room was modest but orderly. A wooden table stood near the window, two chairs drawn close as if someone had recently been seated there. A kettle sat on the iron stove, steam curling from its spout. On a sideboard rested a small framed photograph of a man with broad shoulders and a serious expression. Her husband, Moreau guessed. His jacket was neatly buttoned, his hair combed back with a certain rural pride. The photograph had the faint sepia haze of portraits taken by traveling photographers who set up makeshift studios in barns and courtyards. "Please sit," Madame Lenoir said, though she did not move to offer them coffee. "I heard the church bells ringing earlier than usual. I thought something had happened. The well—" She trailed off, her eyes lowering to her clasped hands. The knuckles were reddened from cold and work, the skin chapped. "You knew there was a body?" Janvier asked, gently enough, but with the directness that came from youth. Her gaze flicked to him, then to Moreau, as though searching for a safer place to rest. "In a village like this," she murmured, "news travels faster than the wind. The boy who found it is the baker's nephew. His aunt comes here each Thursday for milk. By the time you arrived—" She gave a small, helpless shrug. We all knew something terrible had surfaced. Moreau studied her face. There was grief there, yes, and fear, but also a strange composure, as if she were accustomed to bracing herself against events she could not control. He moved his gaze slowly around the room, noting the objects that hinted at a life built on routine. A darning basket near the hearth, boots placed neatly by the door, a rosary hanging from a nail beside the window. Everything seemed accounted for, arranged in a manner that suggested careful maintenance. "You live here alone?" he asked. She nodded. "Since my husband passed, it has been almost a year." "No children?" The question, though inevitable, seemed to strike her like an unexpected blow. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. "No," she said after a moment. "No children." The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Moreau heard the faint ticking of a clock in the adjoining room, the crackle of embers shifting in the stove. Somewhere outside, a hen scratched at the frozen ground. Inside, every sound seemed magnified by the tension that had slipped into the room. "The well near your property," Moreau continued. "Do you use it?" Her eyes flickered to the window, though the well itself was not visible from there. "No," she said. "It dried up years ago. We have a pump closer to the barn." That well has been nothing but a hole in the ground since I was a girl. You grew up here then? Yes. My father owned this farm before my husband. When he died, the land passed to me. My husband took his place in the fields as if the farm had simply exchanged one pair of hands for another. Her voice carried a quiet bitterness that she did not attempt to hide. Do you recall anything unusual happening near that well? Moreau asked. Visitors, noises in the night, someone lingering where they had no reason to be? Something in her expression tightened. It was a small change, but enough. She looked away, toward the narrow doorway leading to the back of the house. Out here, she said slowly, nights are full of noises that mean nothing. Wind in the hedges, animals moving through the fields. Once, years ago, a vagrant slept near the barn for 3 nights, and I only discovered it when I found a cigarette stub in the straw. People come and go. We are used to it. But the well? Moreau pressed gently. Her lips parted, then closed again. She lifted her hands and rubbed them together as if they were cold, though the room was warm. For the first time, her composure seemed to fray. I don't go near it, she said. I haven't since I was a child. It's foolish, I know, but the place has always made me uneasy, as if it were listening. Moreau observed her carefully. Superstitions clung to rural wells like lichen, especially when tragedy had brushed against them. Children fell, animals broke their necks, water turned bitter. Stories grew around such places the way ivy grew along stone. May we see the rest of the house? He asked quietly. Her head snapped up. Why? Routine, he said, letting the words settle between them without aggression. We must understand the lives around the well, the habits of those who live closest to it. It may be nothing, but I cannot ignore it. For a moment, he thought she would refuse. Her body stiffened, her gaze darting again toward the back rooms, and he caught just the flicker of something like panic. Then, as though remembering herself, she exhaled slowly and nodded. Very well, she said. There isn't much to see. She led them through a narrow passage into a smaller room that appeared to serve as both bedroom and storage. A simple bed with an iron frame, the covers pulled tight, a wardrobe with one door slightly warped by years of use, a small table with a jug and basin. Everything was clean, but the austerity of the room suggested that comfort had never been more than a passing guest. Beyond this room, a short corridor extended toward the back of the house. On one side, a door stood half open, revealing shelves filled with jars, sacks of grain, and folded linens. A pantry that also seemed to double as a storeroom. On the opposite side, at the very end of the corridor, was a door that remained firmly closed. Moreau's attention went immediately to it. That one? He asked. Madame Lenoir's steps faltered. It's nothing, she said quickly. Just an old room. My husband used it for tools. It's full of dust and broken things. May I see it? There's no need, she replied too quickly. You said yourself, Inspector, this is routine, surely a room of tools. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her and waited. Silence settled around them like dust, fine and inevitable. Janvier shifted his weight, his hand brushing the wall, fingers grazing the cool plaster. Somewhere in the house, a board creaked softly, as if the structure itself were listening. Madame Lenoir's shoulders sagged. She reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small key, the metal dulled by years of use. For a moment, she held it in her palm, staring at it as though it might give her an argument strong enough to send them away. Then she stepped toward the locked door. As she slid the key into the lock, Moreau noticed the faintest trace of something on the door frame, a small smudge, low to the ground, the kind that might be left by small fingers or by shoes that had not yet grown into adult size. It was almost invisible, a shadow among shadows. But once seen, it could not be unseen. Madame Lenoir turned the key with a soft, reluctant click. She did not open the door immediately. Her hand remained on the knob, fingers white, jaw clenched. In that suspended moment, Moreau sensed that whatever lay beyond would carry the same weight as the bundle raised from the bottom of the well. It might not be as final, perhaps not as stark, but it would speak of the same darkness that had seeped into this quiet farm, filling its corners and hollow spaces. He waited, watching her profile, the rise and fall of her breathing. Then, slowly, she pushed the door open. The stale, enclosed air of the room drifted out into the corridor, bringing with it a faint, unmistakable scent. It was not the smell of tools. It was the smell of a life that had once filled the space with dreams and whispers and tiny footsteps. A child's room. Moreau did not move. He simply stood, letting the image at the threshold imprint itself upon him, feeling the case tilt, almost imperceptibly, toward a deeper truth. The air inside the little bedroom seemed to freeze around Moreau as he stood before the threshold, his breath quiet, his thoughts gathering like storm clouds. The room was small, hardly larger than a cupboard, but every detail inside spoke of a life paused too abruptly. A wooden horse with chipped red paint lay on its side near the skirting board. A blanket, carefully folded, rested at the foot of a narrow cot. On a shelf above it sat a single book, its spine bent from repeated readings, Contes pour enfants, a collection of stories meant to soothe young nerves before sleep. Dust had settled lightly on everything, but not enough to suggest years. It was the dust of months, perhaps weeks. Madame Lenoir stood just behind Moreau, her breath uneven. Janvier hovered near the corridor, his expression caught between shock and something close to anger, though he tried to mask it behind the polite neutrality of a young inspector. "You said you had no children," Moreau said softly, still gazing into the room. Her voice faltered. I didn't mean to lie." "You meant to protect something," Moreau corrected gently. "Or someone." Her hands, bare, thin, trembling, came up to her throat, clutching the edge of her shawl. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Then, with a shudder that rippled through her entire frame, she stepped back from the door as though the sight of the room was too heavy to bear. "He was my nephew," she whispered. "My sister's boy. She died when he was 2. There was no one else to take him." "His name?" Moreau asked. "Henri." The word broke from her like a confession. "He would have been 7 had he stayed with me." "Stayed?" She closed her eyes. "He disappeared last autumn." A chill brushed across Moreau's shoulders, a cold different from the countryside air. He stepped inside the room, careful not to disturb anything. The air smelled faintly of old linen and something sweeter, the remnant of a child's soap long since washed away from memory. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned chair or hastily packed bag. The absence itself felt suffocating. "When did you last see him?" he asked. "Late September," she said, her voice a fragile thread. "He was playing in the yard. I went inside to fetch him a scarf. When I came back, he was gone. Vanished. I alerted the gendarmes immediately. They searched the fields, the barns, the woods. Nothing." "And the village?" Moreau asked. "How did they respond?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "They spoke of foxes, of travelers, of children wandering, but they did not look at me with compassion, Inspector. They looked at me the way people look at someone who has misplaced something precious through carelessness, as if I had been to blame." Moreau understood too well what she meant. Rural France could be unkind to those who lived beyond its unspoken expectations. A widow, a young woman alone on a farm, entrusted with a child not her own. Such a story rarely bred sympathy. Instead, it invited suspicion. "And your husband?" Janvier asked gently. "Was he alive then?" "No," she said. "He had passed earlier that year. Heart, they said, though he was young, too young." The room felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. Moreau stepped back into the corridor, leaving the child's room undisturbed. As he did, he noticed something on the inside of the door. Faint pencil marks, lines drawn at uneven intervals, heights measured, ages written beside them. The last mark, dated September, was higher than the one before it, showing the growth of a child who should still have been alive. He closed the door gently. "Madame Lenoir," he said quietly, "why didn't you tell us this immediately?" Her eyes filled again, not with fresh tears, but with the exhaustion of someone who had held back truth until it had eaten away at her strength. "Because I did not want him dragged into whatever horror was found in that well," she said. "Because the villagers already believe the worst of me. Because I have survived this long by keeping my pain behind closed doors." Moreau studied her carefully. Her fear was real, woven from threads of grief and desperation, but beneath it lay something else. Something like dread, coiled tightly and waiting to strike. Before he could speak again, the sound of hurried footsteps came from the yard. A young gendarme appeared in the doorway, cap in hand, cheeks flushed from running. "Inspector Moreau," he said. "There's something at the post office. The telegraph operator insists you come at once." "What is it?" Moreau asked. "A telegram," the young man said, swallowing. "Addressed to someone dead." Moreau's heartbeat slowed. "Who?" The gendarme hesitated. "To Madame Lenoir's husband." The silence that followed was absolute. Madame Lenoir swayed as if struck. Janvier caught her arm, steadying her as her knees threatened to give way. "That's impossible," she whispered. "He's been gone almost a year." Moreau exchanged a glance with Janvier, then he stepped back, retrieving his hat from the peg near the door. "Madame," he said gently, "will you walk with us?" But she shook her head with a quickness that startled even her. "No," she said, voice cracking. "I cannot. I won't set foot in that square again." Her eyes held terror, not of the well, but of something else, something unseen. "Very well," Moreau said. "We will return once we understand what's been sent." He and Janvier stepped outside into the cold air. The door closed behind them with a soft but decisive click. As they crossed the yard, Moreau glanced once back toward the house. A curtain in the child's room shifted slightly, though no wind touched it. Whether it was a trick of light or something else, he could not say. They continued along the path to the village, boots sinking into the softening earth. The sun had climbed higher, but the countryside had not warmed. A hush settled over the fields, a hush that carried weight. "What do you think we'll find?" Janvier asked. "Something that should not exist," Moreau replied. The post office sat at the edge of the square, its windows small and fogged from the warmth within. The telegraph operator, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous twitch beneath one eye, met them at the door. "Came through at dawn," he said, thrusting a folded slip of paper toward Moreau. "I swear I checked the address twice." Moreau unfolded the telegram carefully. The words were sparse, but each one struck like a blow. "Meet at the well before they return. Do not trust her. H." The signature was little more than a jagged letter, torn off by the machine's abrupt end. "Her?" Janvier murmured. "Who is her?" Moreau didn't answer. He reread the message, noting its urgency, the fractured rhythm of its phrasing. It bore none of the formal structure of ordinary telegrams. It was more like a plea, a warning. And then another detail struck him with sudden force. The telegram's timestamp. Sent at 3 a.m, hours before the boy discovered the bundle. "Who brought this?" Moreau asked. "No one," the operator insisted. "It arrived on the line. But the station it claims to have come from... Inspector, that station has been closed since the flood 2 years ago." Moreau felt the chill return. A message sent from a station without power. Addressed to a dead man. Warning of a meeting at a well where a body waited. The question was not whether the telegram was real. The question was whose voice had spoken through the machine. He folded the paper, sliding it into his coat. The operator watched him with wide, fearful eyes, as though he feared the machine might speak again. "Inspector," Janvier said quietly, "what does this mean?" Moreau looked toward the path that led to the Lenoir farm, the curve of the fields, the distant silhouette of the house where a child's room stood hidden behind a locked door. "It means," he said, "that the well isn't the only place where something has been buried." He stepped outside, the cold settling around him like a second skin. The case had acquired a new voice, a voice that did not belong to the living. He began walking. The day had turned, and the truth was beginning to stir. The train station of Villeneuve-sur-Lac sat at the far edge of the village, a modest structure of weathered timber and stone that seemed almost ashamed of its own existence. It was the kind of place where trains arrived with reluctance, exhaling brief clouds of steam before continuing toward towns that boasted more activity, more urgency, more life. The platform planks creaked underfoot as Moreau and Janvier approached, their boots leaving damp impressions from the frost that had begun to melt under the midday sun. The smell of coal and rust mingled with the faint aroma of stale bread drifting from the small cafe that faced the tracks. Above the station door hung an old metal sign, faded and dented, announcing routes that no longer ran. Inside the cafe, the air was heavy with the scent of black coffee and pipe smoke. A few men sat scattered at the tables, shoulders hunched, eyes dipped low, as though determined to avoid the gaze of strangers. The cafe felt like a room where secrets collected in the corners, gathering layer upon layer of unspoken histories. When Moreau entered, a hush spread, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations dimmed. A chair scraped across the wooden floor too sharply. A man set his cup down with deliberate care, his eyes flicking nervously toward the inspectors. At the counter, the proprietor, a stout man with a grey mustache and a stained apron, polished a glass with a threadbare cloth. His movements were practiced, steady, almost mechanical. "Looking for someone?" he asked without lifting his eyes. "We're looking for a traveler who came in on last evening's train," Moreau said. "A man alone, well-dressed, no luggage." The proprietor's cloth paused mid-swipe. His jaw tightened ever so slightly before he resumed polishing the glass. "A lot of people pass through," he said, though the tone suggested otherwise. "Not here," Janvier murmured. "Not in winter. Not without reason." The proprietor's gaze flicked up, wary. Moreau watched the man's expression closely, noting the way his brow pinched, how his shoulders tensed. These were not the reactions of a man indifferent to the question. Moreau approached the counter, lowering his voice. "We don't seek to disturb your peace, but I believe the man sought more than coffee, and I believe you know who I mean." For a moment, the proprietor seemed to consider denial. Then he sighed, setting the glass down with a faint clink. "He didn't give a name," the proprietor said. "Didn't ask for a room. Just sat by the window for an hour, staring at the tracks. Ordered nothing but water. No one does that." He glanced toward a table in the corner, where an empty chair faced the window, its wooden back slightly askew. He sat there. "What time did he leave?" Moreau asked. "Just after dusk. I saw him step out toward the alley behind the station. Didn't see where he went after that." Moreau thanked him, then turned toward the alleyway. He felt Janvier close behind him, the younger inspector's footsteps quickening. Outside, the air carried the damp chill of approaching evening, though the sun still hung low in the sky. The alley behind the station was narrow and shadowed, bordered on one side by the cafe's rear wall, and on the other by a row of stacked crates covered in tarpaulin. A small door, barely more than a slit in the stone, led into a storage space. Beside it lay a scattering of cigarette butts, ground flat by hurried boots. "He was here," Janvier murmured, crouching to pick up one of the butts. "Foreign brand, not something the locals smoke." Moreau knelt, examining the footprints in the softened earth. One set heading toward the station, light and narrow. Another set heading away, deeper, angled toward the pathway that led into the trees. Someone had followed someone. The question was, who followed whom? He rose, brushing dirt from his coat. "Search the tree line," he said. He didn't leave the village. They walked toward the edge of the woods, where bare branches clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. The shadows stretched long across the ground, the fading light weaving through the trunks in narrow, uneven strands. As they moved deeper, the air grew colder. Moreau's breath formed faint clouds before him. "He came this way," Janvier said, pointing to a series of footprints. "Careful steps, but not careful enough." 20 meters in, they found the stranger. He sat slumped against a tree, one hand pressed to his side, the other gripping a threadbare coat that did little to protect him from the cold. His face was pale, almost chalk-like, and his eyes, wide, frantic, flashed with terror as he saw the inspectors approach. "Don't," he whispered, though neither man had moved. "Don't come closer." Moreau stopped several paces away, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. "You're hurt," he said softly. "We can help you." "No one can help me now," the man rasped, reaching into his coat. Janvier's hand flew toward his holster, but the stranger did not draw a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He held it out with trembling fingers. "Take it," he said, "before they find me." Moreau stepped forward, slowly, carefully. He took the paper, his eyes scanning the hurried, uneven handwriting. It was a list of names, half legible, half smudged. One name caught his attention immediately. Henri Lenoir. His pulse tightened. "Where did you get this?" he asked. The man coughed, a harsh, rattling sound. "I didn't know what they were planning. I thought it was just business, deliveries, quiet exchanges. But then I read the ledger, saw the names, the ages. Children, Inspector. Children." The word sliced through the quiet woods like a blade. Moreau's voice remained steady. "Who are they?" The man shook his head violently. "I don't know all their names, only faces. Men in coats who meet at night, down by the river near the old barges. They send messages through abandoned lines, stations closed years ago. They hide in plain sight, Inspector, and when someone tries to leave..." His voice broke, and he clutched his side, grimacing. Moreau knelt beside him, gently pulling back the man's coat. A wound, a deep gash, likely made by a knife, bled through the fabric, darkening it with damp heat. "Who did this?" Moreau asked. The man's eyes flickered upward, filled with something that was part fear, part resignation. "I made the mistake of asking questions," he whispered. "Once I knew the well wasn't the first place something had been thrown away. They mocked me." Moreau exchanged a glance with Janvier. The younger inspector's jaw clenched, his breath tight. "What were you doing at the well?" Janvier asked. The stranger's head dropped back against the tree, his breaths coming slower. "I went to see if it was true, if something had been left there months ago. But when I reached the village, I saw the boy. Heard the whispers. Someone else was already there. Something worse." His hand groped for Moreau's sleeve. Moreau leaned closer. "Tell me," Moreau urged. "What did you see?" The stranger's lips trembled. His gaze drifted past Moreau's shoulder, toward the dimming sky. "I heard crying," he whispered. "A child's voice, echoing from the bottom, only the well was empty when I looked." Moreau felt the earth tilt under him. He stayed steady, eyes locked on the man's face. "What did the voice say?" he asked. The stranger blinked slowly, as though the memory cost him the last of his strength. "It kept saying one word," he murmured. "One name." Moreau swallowed. "Whose name?" "Henri." The man exhaled, long and low. His body sagged. The woods fell utterly silent. Janvier pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, then shook his head. Moreau closed the dead man's eyes with a quiet, solemn gesture. The cold air tightened around them. "What now?" Janvier asked, voice low. Moreau stood, folding the paper with the list of names. He looked toward the direction of the river. Far from here, beyond the village, where barges floated like shadows beneath Parisian bridges. "Now," he said, "we find out how a child can cry from the bottom of a well that holds no child." He turned back toward the village, the first threads of twilight weaving through the trees. Behind him, the wind stirred the dead man's coat, lifting it like a whispered farewell. Ahead, a truth waited that neither the well nor the village could keep buried much longer. The storm arrived before dusk, sweeping across Villeneuve-sur-Lac with a force that felt almost deliberate, as if the sky itself wished to conceal whatever truth Moreau was beginning to unearth. Clouds rolled low, a heavy curtain of slate gray pressing against the rooftops. The first drops fell as Moreau and Janvier crossed the square, fat and cold, striking the cobblestones with a rhythmic insistence that grew louder, steadier, until the entire village seemed wrapped in a shroud of rain. The air thickened with the scent of damp stone, wet earth, and the metallic tang that always accompanies storms in rural France. They had left the dead stranger where they found him, guarded by 2 gendarmes who would retrieve the body once the rain eased. Moreau carried with him the list of names, the paper drying in the warmth of his coat pocket, though its weight seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. On the walk back to the village, his thoughts circled around the stranger's final words, the whisper that refused to release its grip. Henri. That name, spoken by a dying man who had never set foot on the Lenoir farm, had the unmistakable ring of truth, or of something dangerously close to it. The rain intensified as they followed the old mill road that curved around the edge of the village. Puddles gathered in the ruts left by cartwheels, reflecting the trembling glow of lanterns set in windows. Water streamed from the eaves of houses, forming thin, wavering curtains that distorted the shapes. Behind them, thunder rumbled distantly, a slow, rolling growl that seemed to echo the turmoil building inside Moreau. As they neared the bend in the road where the mill once stood, a structure now long abandoned, its roof caved in and its wheel motionless, Moreau noticed something half buried in the mud. It lay just off the road near the footprint of a tractor wheel. At first it looked like a torn scrap of cloth, plastered flat by the rain. But as the lantern light from a nearby window flickered across it, a corner lifted, revealing a glimmer of something white beneath. Moreau stopped abruptly. "What is it?" Janvier asked, wiping rain from his face. Moreau crouched, fingers sinking slightly into the mud as he retrieved the object. It was a photograph, its edges frayed, the image blurred by moisture, but still intact enough to discern its contents. He held it beneath the glow of his lantern, shielding it from the rain with his hand. The photograph showed a child, thin, dark-haired, with wide, serious eyes, standing beside an adult whose face was half cut from the frame, but whose coat and posture were unmistakable. Even distorted by water, the child's expression bore a striking resemblance to the height marks behind the door of the locked room. "Henri," Janvier whispered. Moreau said nothing. He turned the photograph in his hand, examining the background. A hedge, a section of stone wall, and behind them the sloping roof of a barn. Not the Lenoir farm, somewhere else. Somewhere the child had been taken. The adult figure, though the face was missing, stood with an authority that unsettled Moreau. A gloved hand rested lightly on the child's shoulder. The posture was relaxed, almost casual, but the grip seemed subtly possessive, dominant, as though the adult believed the child belonged to them. "Whoever dropped this was in a hurry," Janvier said softly. "Running, maybe." Moreau nodded. The rain hammered harder now, blurring the landscape, turning the road into a narrow river of brown water. Lightning flashed, illuminating the abandoned mill in stark, ghostly white. For a fleeting moment, the twisted beams and broken wheel cast long, reaching shadows across the road. "We need to shelter," Janvier said, "at least until the worst passes." But Moreau barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the photograph. Something tugged at his memory. The angle of the barn roof, the way the hedge curved inward. He had seen that layout before, not with his eyes, but with the trained instinct that catalogued environments as part of every investigation. It came to him slowly, like a picture forming beneath the surface of disturbed water. The river road, the one that led to the old barge mooring, where the stranger claimed they met. Moreau slipped the photograph into the inner pocket of his coat and stood, rain streaming down his face. The storm soaked through the fabric of his trousers, plastering them to his legs, but he hardly felt the cold. What concerned him was the path the photograph had taken, how it had ended up on the mill road rather than near the river. Someone had carried it away from the mooring, perhaps intending to burn it, discard it, or hide it. But the storm had intervened. Fate, or chance, had dropped it directly into Moreau's path. They took shelter beneath the mill's remaining awning, a sagging, half-rotted structure that provided little protection from the rain, but allowed the inspectors a moment to gather themselves. Thunder echoed again, louder this time, rolling across the countryside with a force that seemed to shake the ground. "You think this is connected to the telegram?" Janvier asked. Moreau considered the question. The telegram, the dying man, the names in the ledger, each thread pulled them towards something larger, darker, more complicated than a single tragedy at the bottom of a well. The stranger's final confession, men in coats, nighttime exchanges, voices carried across abandoned telegraph lines, fit too neatly with the photograph's appearance. "Yes," Moreau said quietly. "Everything is connected. We just don't yet see the shape." "And Madame Lenoir?" Janvier asked. Moreau closed his eyes briefly. He pictured the trembling in her hands, the way she hesitated before unlocking the door to the child's room, the fear that had tightened her voice when they mentioned the telegram. She was hiding something, but whether it was guilt or terror was still unclear. "She knows more than she can bear to speak aloud," Moreau murmured. "But she may not be lying when she says she doesn't understand all of it." "What about the adult in the photograph?" Janvier pressed. "Could it be her husband?" "No," Moreau said immediately, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Her husband died before the child disappeared. And the stance, the hand—" He tapped the photograph's pocket. "This person is alive and close." Lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating the countryside in a stark, violent flash that made every blade of grass appear etched in silver. For that instant, Moreau saw something down the road, a figure moving through the curtain of rain, hunched beneath a heavy coat, head lowered. A man, too large to be a villager, caught unawares. Moreau exhaled sharply. "Someone's out there," he said, pushing away from the mill wall. Janvier peered into the rain. "Are you sure? It could have been—" "It wasn't the light," Moreau insisted. "He was watching us." They stepped back onto the muddy road, lanterns swinging, rain lashing at their coats. The figure was gone now, swallowed by the storm and the bend of the road. But footprints remained, fresh ones, deep ones, heading toward the main village. "Follow them," Moreau said. They moved quickly, splashing through puddles, lanterns bobbing like small stars in the deluge. The wind roared through the easy trees, bending their branches low as though urging the inspectors onward. The tracks veered off the road onto a footpath leading toward the lower fields, the same direction the stranger had hinted at, toward the river, toward the abandoned barge mooring. The storm grew fiercer, the rain striking their faces with stinging force. The path turned slippery, forcing them to slow. Water pooled in the hollows, blurring the prints. Moreau kept his head low, scanning the ground, refusing to lose the trail. "Inspector!" Janvier called suddenly. Moreau looked up. At the crest of the hill, near the broken fence that bordered the lower pastures, a lantern flickered briefly, too bright, too deliberate to be natural. Someone was signaling, or warning, or waiting. The light vanished. Moreau's pulse spiked. He started forward, but a sudden sound froze him. A voice, a child's cry, carried faintly on the storm wind, high, trembling, unmistakably human, unmistakably young. Janvier's face went pale. That came from the river, Moreau finished. They ran. Down the hill, across the flooded pasture, through the sheets of rain, chasing a voice that should not exist, could not exist, but rang with the pulse of truth. The waterlogged earth shifted under their feet, but they pushed on, driven by instinct, fear, and something more primal. The hope that the cry was real, not memory or imagination or haunting. And in the darkness ahead, barely visible through the storm, the outline of the old barge mooring emerged. A place where secrets gathered, a place where names were written in ledgers, a place where someone had once stood beside a child for a photograph. A place where a voice waited, calling again. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a hushed, washed-out village, its rooftops beaded with silver droplets that glimmered in the early light. The river, swollen from the night's violence, moved with a sluggish, murky weight beneath the arched stone bridge near the barge mooring. The cries Moreau and Janvier had heard in the tempest, those thin, trembling echoes that carried the unmistakable timbre of a child, had dissolved into silence by the time they reached the water's edge. Nothing remained but a thick fog rising off the river, curling in spectral tendrils that clung to their coats and blurred the landscape. Moreau stood on the mooring's edge, boots sinking slightly into mud, the photograph burning cold in his coat pocket. The river lapped gently at the stones, as though mocking the urgency that had brought them there hours earlier. No footprints remained, only a few scattered reeds flattened by the storm. Whatever had moved through the darkness, whatever had called out in that desperate voice, had vanished with the retreating night. Janvier scanned the fog, lantern in hand. Could it have been the wind, Inspector? Moreau shook his head. Voices carried by wind lose shape. They fray. This one didn't. His gaze moved, slowly across the mooring, the rusted cleats, the half-rotten posts jutting from the water, the remnants of an old barge swollen with river water. The place felt frayed at the edges, like a memory left too long in the sun. "Someone was here," Moreau murmured. "Someone who knew we were coming." As they turned back toward the village, the first hints of morning light filtered through the fog, giving the world an otherworldly pallor. Birds began to stir in the hedges, their tentative chirps sounding strangely fragile after the night's tumult. The road back to Villeneuve-sur-Lac gleamed with puddles that reflected the sky in jagged fragments. The entire countryside felt pulled taut, as though the storm had exposed fissures in places once thought solid. By the time they reached the village square, shutters were opening, and shopkeepers began sweeping rainwater from their thresholds. Yet talk of the well, the investigators, and the stranger's death clung to every doorway. Moreau felt the weight of their gazes, curious, fearful, calculating. He headed directly toward the small office of the gendarmerie where the list of names and the stranger's body would be secured. Inside, a stale warmth permeated the room, carrying the scent of tobacco and damp wool. The sergeant on duty gave a stiff nod, his face pale from a sleepless night. "The postmaster came by," the sergeant said. "He says something odd happened with the telegraph." Moreau braced himself. "Go on." "A message tried to come through just before dawn, only static and half-formed letters. But the signature, well, he said it looked like the same single initial as last time." "Huh," Moreau murmured. The letter hung in the air like a ghost. Janvier frowned. "But the line from the abandoned station shouldn't even—" "It shouldn't," Moreau agreed. "And yet it did. He turned toward the window, watching the villagers move about their morning routines with hurried restraint. He had no illusions about rural secrecy. A village could hide 1,000 private griefs behind its shutters and still smile at the baker as though the world was whole. But there were limits, and this case was beginning to stretch those limits to the breaking point. Moreau left the gendarmerie and walked toward the Café de la Marine, a modest establishment near the river, marked by a weather-beaten sign depicting a sailor raising a glass. The café's windows glowed with early morning lamplight, warm and inviting. A few fishermen sat at the tables, their clothes still damp from the morning mist, their boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. Behind the counter stood the owner, Monsieur Garel, a man whose round face and gentle manner belied a sharpness behind his eyes. He greeted Moreau with cautious respect. "Inspector," Garel said, wiping his hands on a towel. "If you're here for coffee, it's strong this morning." "The coffee can wait," Moreau replied. "I need to ask you about a room you once rented, the one above the cafe." A flicker of recognition crossed Garel's face, quickly masked by concern. "That room hasn't been used in months." "But it was used," Moreau said evenly. "And recently enough that someone left clues they hoped no one would find." Garel hesitated. His gaze drifted toward the door at the back of the cafe, the one that led to the narrow staircase. "Inspector, there are things people prefer not to talk about. Old arrangements, brief guests who left quietly." "Who rented it?" Moreau pressed. Garel swallowed. "A woman, some months ago. Paid in cash. Stayed only a week. She kept the shutters closed, went out at odd hours, and asked for food to be left outside the door. I never saw her face clearly. Always had a veil. But there was something fragile about her, like someone who'd lived too long in fear." Moreau felt a familiar tightening in his chest. "Did she give a name?" "She signed the ledger as Madame R. No more." R. A letter too carefully chosen to be a coincidence. Moreau exchanged a glance with Janvier. "Take us upstairs," Moreau said. Garel led them up the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath their weight. At the top of the stairs stood a single door. Garel unlocked it with a small brass key, then stepped back. The room was dim, the shutters still closed. Dust motes drifted in the slanted light coming from between the slats. The air was stale, carrying an undercurrent of lavender, similar to the scent in Madame Lenoir's house. But there was something else beneath it, the faint smell of ink and paper, as if someone had spent hours writing here in silence. Moreau crossed the room slowly. The furniture was minimal. A narrow bed, a small table, a chair, and a wash basin. On the table lay remnants of torn paper. A single envelope, its flap unsealed, sat beside them. Moreau lifted it carefully. No address. Inside, a small card. A list of 3 names: Henri Lenoir, Émile Lambert, Sophie Renault's children, all marked with the same small symbol, an inked circle, barely the size of a coin. Below the names, written in a hurried, trembling hand. They promised safety. They lied. Moreau's breath quickened. He looked at Garel. "When did she leave?" "Late autumn," Garel said quietly. "During the harvest festival. She slipped away before dawn. No one saw her go." Moreau turned the envelope over. A faint watermark spread through the paper. A decorative crest. The crest matched the one on the ledger Janvier had retrieved from the stranger's coat. A pattern was emerging, dark and deliberate. "Inspector," Janvier said, pointing toward the wash basin. Moreau moved toward it. Inside lay a small object, half hidden under a cloth. He lifted the cloth and felt his pulse jolt. A child's shoe, caked with dried mud, the same size as the footprint they had seen near the river. Moreau steadied, himself against the table. Garel's voice trembled. "She was always terrified, Inspector. Every time someone knocked downstairs, I could hear her gasp through the ceiling. as if she expected someone or something to come for her. And yet she didn't run far, Moreau said, his voice low, only far enough to delay the inevitable. He looked around the room again. The air felt charged, filled with the echoes of someone who had lived in fear, someone hiding from a danger she could not outrun. Moreau closed the envelope and slipped it into his coat beside the photograph. The threads were tightening. A child's disappearance, a woman on the run, a stranger murdered for asking questions, telegrams from abandoned stations, and now a room above a cafe, soaked in unease, holding a single shoe that should not exist. "We need to return to Paris," Moreau said, turning toward Janvier. "Not to leave the case, but to follow it to the next shadow." Janvier nodded. "To the river network?" "To the river network," Moreau replied, "and to the men who think children can be hidden as easily as stolen goods." As they left the cafe, the fog seemed to part just enough for Moreau to glimpse the river once more, its surface smooth, deceptive, concealing everything that drifted beneath. Not for long, he thought. Not anymore. Paris greeted them with a muted, metallic sky, as though the city had wrapped itself in a shroud of its own making. The wind coming off the Seine carried a late winter bite, sharp and unforgiving, and the cobblestones gleamed with the faint sheen left by a morning drizzle. Moreau felt the familiar weight of the capital settle upon him, a heaviness made of stone bridges, narrow alleys, and the invisible currents of human traffic that moved through its veins. He had always believed that Paris spoke in murmurs, that its secrets lingered in corners the way dampness clung to the walls of the quay. Today, its voice felt congested, troubled, as if the vast city itself sensed what had traveled from Villeneuve-sur-Lac to its gates. Janvier walked beside him, collar turned up, eyes scanning the river. The younger inspector had grown quieter since their return. The findings in the room above the Café de la Marine, the photograph, the dying stranger's last words, each had added a layer of gravity to his demeanor. Moreau recognized the transformation. Every inspector faced such a moment when the world's darker truths stepped forward and demanded acknowledgement. Their destination lay at the eastern end of the Seine, somewhere where the river bent around a series of industrial docks. Barges, old, rust-stained and low in the water, were moored in uneven lines. The smell of oil, tar, and decaying river weeds clung thickly to the air. These were not the waterways lined with artists and lovers, nor the well-trodden paths where tourists wandered with guidebooks in hand. This was the underbelly, where the city stored its secrets, beneath coarse canvas and coarse men. Moreau had arranged to meet an old contact, Renard, a barge worker whose loyalty had been tested over the years by proximity to the river's shadows. Renard understood things. Tides, rumors, shipments that were spoken of in half-sentences, debts paid in envelopes. If there was a network moving children through the river system, if the name Henri Lenoir had been spoken in any whispered deal or clandestine exchange, Renard would know. They found him where the Quai de la Gare narrowed under a rusting iron crane. Renard stood with one foot on the gunwale of a barge, jacket patched in a dozen places, pipe clutched between yellowed fingers. His eyes, small, quick, shrewd, watched Moreau approach with an unreadable curiosity. "Inspector," Renard said, pulling the pipe from his mouth. "Thought you'd forgotten I still breathe this foul river air." "I need information," Moreau replied. "And I believe you know why." Renard's expression darkened. "There's been talk." His gaze drifted toward the water. "Talk of things moving through the night that shouldn't. Things no honest man wants to see." Moreau exchanged a glance with Janvier. "Children?" he asked quietly. Renard flinched, not outwardly, but in the tightness that seized his shoulders. "Not just children," Renard murmured. "Voices, crates that shift on their own, barges that dock without lanterns, and men who don't belong to any company I know, meeting under the bridges when the tide is lowest." Moreau stepped closer. "Tell me everything." Renard inhaled slowly, drawing the damp air into lungs already lined with decades of smoke. "There's a man they call Le Passeur," he said. "He moves between villages, rivers, train stations no one uses anymore. Doesn't stay in one place long enough for the police to catch his scent. He's been paid to deliver things that can't appear on ledgers, and he uses the river because the river forgets." Moreau felt the pieces shifting. "Does he work alone?" Renard shook his head. "There's a network, Inspector. Men who watch. Men who listen. Men who make sure nothing slips through the cracks." "And women?" Janvier asked. Renard hesitated. "One. A woman in a veil. She's spoken of in whispers. A messenger, perhaps. Or someone running from something. They say she left a trail as faint as smoke. Her name, if it is her name, is Rousseau. Or Renaud. It changes depending on who tells the story. Sophie Renaud. The name on the list." Moreau's pulse quickened. "Where can we find this Passeur?" Renard's laugh was humorless. "If I knew that, Inspector, I'd have sold the information long ago, but—" He lowered his voice. "I can tell you where to listen." He pointed toward the underside of the Pont de Bercy, where a series of arches cast deep, echoing shadows over the water. "At low tide," Renard said, "voices gather beneath the arches. Men think the river swallows sound there. But the stone remembers." Moreau nodded. "Thank you." "Be careful, Inspector," Renard warned, pipe trembling slightly. "The river doesn't forgive men who listen too closely." Moreau and Janvier walked along the quay until they reached the stairs leading to the riverbank beneath the bridge. Water slapped softly against the moss-covered stones. The tide was receding, revealing the slick, slippery ground where river workers once hauled nets ashore. They stepped carefully under the arch. At first, there was only silence, the hush of water, the groan of the bridge above, a faint echo of footsteps from the quay, then voices, faint, fragmented. A man's murmur carried on the air, another answered with a guttural rumble, a third voice, thin, almost boyish, cut through briefly as if struggling against a cloth or a hand. Janvier stiffened. "Inspector—" Moreau raised a hand. "Wait." The echoes drifted from deeper within the arches. Someone was speaking in code, using phrases that meant nothing to passers-by but everything to the men who shared them. Then Moreau heard something new. A splash, a scrape, the sound of something heavy being dragged. Not a crate. A body. His pulse hammered. He moved forward silently, keeping to the shadows, Janvier close behind. The arch opened into a wider cavity, where lantern light flickered against the stone walls. The silhouettes of 3 men shifted near the waterline. They lifted a bundle, long, narrow, wrapped, and lowered it toward a half-submerged skiff. Moreau couldn't see what was inside, but he recognized the shape, the same shape he had seen raised from the well. A chill crawled up his spine. He stepped forward, but a hand clamped over his mouth. Janvier turned in shock, but Moreau raised a finger. Silence. It was Renard. He leaned close, whispering hotly in Moreau's ear. "If you go now, you die. They're armed, and the river will swallow you before dawn." Moreau's fists clenched. He needed to see what was in that bundle, but Renard's grip tightened. "One wrong move," Renard hissed, "and they'll throw you in the water with the rest." Moreau forced himself to retreat into the shadows. Janvier followed, fury tightening his jaw. Once the men and their skiff drifted away, Renard released him. "You want to stop them?" Renard panted. "Then meet me tonight, midnight. I'll take you somewhere the river doesn't like to reveal." "Where?" Moreau demanded. Renard looked out over the black water. "Where the voices wait," he said grimly. "Where the waterline keeps the truth pinned beneath it." He paused. "And where a child cried last night." The world seemed to tilt. Henri? Moreau whispered. Renard's eyes hardened. Not just Henri. He walked away, leaving Moreau standing beneath the bridge as the river whispered against the stones. Janvier broke the silence. Inspector, what are we dealing with? Moreau stared into the black water, seeing the reflection of the bridge, the city, and something else. Something moving beneath the surface that was not the current. A network, he said quietly. One that believes no one will listen to the voices beneath the waterline. He began walking. But we will. The night ahead would not be forgiving, but it would speak, and Moreau intended to hear every word. Night fell over Paris with a quiet, predatory grace, wrapping the city in layers of stillness broken only by the distant rumble of carriages and the occasional echo of footsteps along the quay. The river, swollen and black beneath the bridges, reflected none of the lamplight that shimmered along its banks. It moved like a creature in half-sleep, its currents whispering secrets gathered from upstream villages. Secrets that had followed Moreau all the way from Villeneuve-sur-Lac. Midnight approached slowly, the hour stretching across the city like a held breath. And beneath the stone arch of the Pont de Bercy, where shadows pooled thick as ink, Moreau waited for Renard. Janvier stood at his side, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the river's restless surface. The young inspector's face carried a tautness that had grown sharper with each revelation of the case. Moreau could see the fatigue in the lines around his mouth, could feel the tension in the air between them, the tension that always rises when the truth is close, too close, almost within reach. Finally, from beneath the bridge, a figure emerged. Renard stepped from the darkness, pipe unlit, coat soaked from the river mist. He nodding once, the gesture brief but urgent. "Come," he whispered, "before the tide turns." He led them along a narrow path that ran between the bridge supports and the river bank. The moon, half concealed by clouds, cast only faint, uncertain light. Moreau walked with measured steps, boots slipping occasionally on the slick stones. Janvier followed closely, one hand brushing the wall to steady himself. Renard guided them to a low archway built into the embankment, a storm drain or maintenance tunnel half hidden by moss and shadow. Water trickled from its opening, forming a shallow, reflective sheet across the path. Moreau frowned. "You want us to go in there?" Renard nodded. "Voices echo here before they vanish into the river. The men who use the waterway for their dealings. This is where they listen, and where they speak of what they hide." Janvier glanced at Moreau, who nodded once. Together they crouched and slipped into the tunnel. Inside, the air changed immediately, damp, enclosed, carrying the smell of rusted iron and riverstone. The walls, slick with moisture, bore faint marks where crates had been dragged through. The tunnel curved downward, guiding them deeper beneath the street. Renard lit a small lantern, its flame flickering, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. After several minutes, the tunnel widened into a chamber. It was not large, barely the size of a storage room, but its ceiling arched high into darkness. The floor was covered with flattened rushes, suggesting the place had been used as a waiting point or meeting space. A wooden crate rested in one corner, its lid partially ajar. Renard set the lantern down and stepped aside. Moreau approached, heart pounding. Janvier hovered behind him. Inside the crate were small garments, children's garments, folded with unsettling care. A pair of shoes, a woolen cap, a doll missing one eye. Moreau touched nothing. He simply stared, each breath growing heavier. "Inspector," Janvier whispered, This is a holding place." "For those being moved," Moreau said. "And for those being lost," Renard added quietly. A long silence followed. Then Renard crouched near the rush-covered floor and motioned them closer. "They bring them here first," he said, "when the river is quiet, before the barges come." "Why here?" Moreau asked. Because the stones drown sound, Renard said. If a child cries, the river swallows it. None of the bargemen hear, none of the men on the quay hear, only the ones inside these walls. The weight of his words pressed down like a stone. Moreau felt a surge of anger, cold and deep. You've heard it, he said. Renard nodded, his expression grim. Voices, whispers, sometimes the cry of someone who does not belong in darkness. Moreau looked around the chamber, noticing something he had missed, scratch marks on the wall. Small, chaotic, the frantic, improvised writing of a small hand. He leaned close, lantern light illuminating faint shapes. Letters, a name, Henri. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. We need to leave, Renard said. The tide is changing. They'll come soon. Who? Janvier whispered. Those who take, Renard replied. Those who silence. Moreau straightened. Then let them come. Renard's pipe trembled in his fist. You don't understand. These men aren't village gossips or petty thieves. They're part of something threaded through the river system, something that uses fear the way a fisherman uses nets. Moreau placed a hand on his shoulder. I've dealt with men who believe they stand above consequences. Renard stared at him for a long, quiet moment. Then listen, Inspector. Because consequences are coming. Before Moreau could ask, a sound drifted through the tunnel. Footsteps, slow, confident, echoing. Janvier extinguished the lantern instantly, plunging them into darkness. Only the faint glow from the tunnel's mouth remained, casting a sickly oval of dim light on the chamber floor. The footsteps drew closer. Renard whispered, almost inaudibly, Hide. They pressed themselves against the chamber wall, sinking into shadow. Two silhouettes entered, their shapes tall, broad, unmistakably familiar. Moreau recognized the posture of men who believe they own the ground beneath their feet. One carried a lantern. The flame illuminated the chamber enough to reveal their stern, angular faces. The lantern's glow slid across the crate of children's belongings, lingered on the scratched letters, then flicked briefly across the very corner where Moreau and the others hid. The taller man spoke. Another one gone, he muttered. The river took him last night. The other spat on the ground. Not our fault, he panicked. If he'd stayed quiet, he'd still be on the list. They always talk about children crying, phantoms, voices, weak men imagining things. The river cleans what it needs to. The taller man knelt beside the crate. Anything left from the last delivery? The second shrugged. Just scraps. It doesn't matter. The next shipment comes this weekend. From the south. We'll need to prep the room above the cafe. Moreau's breath caught. The room above the cafe. Madame Henri. Everything converged. Janvier's fingers tightened around his revolver. Moreau placed a hand over his wrist. Not yet. The two men finished their inspection, then lifted the crate's lid and secured it. The taller man extinguished the lantern. Let the river do its work, he muttered. Their footsteps retreated, diminishing into distant echoes. Moreau waited until Renard whispered, Now. They slipped out of the chamber and retraced their steps through the tunnel. Emerging into the cold midnight air felt like breaking the surface after too long underwater. The river gurgled beside them, black and bottomless. Renard paused, breath ragged. You heard them? Moreau nodded grimly. I heard enough. Janvier's voice shook with fury. Inspector, we can't let them move another child. Not one. We need the gendarmes, the river patrol, the press. No, Moreau said sharply. Janvier blinked. No. This network has roots in places you and I cannot storm with lanterns and outrage. If we act too soon, they scatter, disappear. The children disappear. The evidence disappears. Janvier swallowed. Then what do we do? Moreau stepped to the water's edge. We wait until they come for the next child. Janvier stared at him, horror blooming across his face. "You can't mean I will not let a child vanish," Moreau said quietly. "But to save one, we must catch those who take them, all of them, at once." Renard exhaled shakily. "Then you'll need bait." Moreau looked toward the far end of the river, where the city lights dimmed into fog. "No," he said. "We need truth." The next morning, Paris stirred under a pale winter sun. Carriages rolled across bridges. Shopkeepers opened shutters. Children hurried to school, scarves flapping behind them, and from his office at Quai des Orfèvres, Inspector Moreau drafted letters. Letters that would summon the exact people he needed to trap the river's shadows. But as he sealed the last envelope, he paused. A faint sound drifted through the open window, a cry, soft, childlike, echoing from the river. Whether memory or warning, he could not tell. But he knew this. It would not be the last cry he heard. Not until he brought the entire network down. Not until Henri's name, and all the others, were no longer whispered from the waterline. And for the first time since the well in Villeneuve-sur-Lac, Moreau felt something close to certainty. The truth was no longer buried. It was rising,